Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those too at home who are relaxing in their armchairs. We trust that you'll enjoy our worship together as we study God's Word. I was told by the organisers of the service today that the preliminaries would take about 5 or 10 minutes. If you look at your watches, you'll see that was extended just a little bit, but because we don't have any Sabbath school, I guess I can preach as long as I like. I don't get the opportunity very often here, so anyway, I actually wondered whether I'd be here today, right up until the last moment, even though each day since our Queensland Premier announced that the border was going into hard lockdown. Does that mean I can't get here? I could get here, but could I get home? Or I go into lockdown for 2 weeks in a hotel at my expense. And I rang the health department yesterday and there were still no border passes available. And they said, well, listen, I suggest you go to church anyway. And when you get to church, if you still haven't got a border pass, before you get in your car and come home, go online on your phone and see if you can get one at that point. And if you still can't get one, go anyway. So I decided that wasn't bad advice, and so I slept fairly well last night. I was listening to Mel talking about Beirut, and I hadn't intended to mention this, but I got a text or an email this morning from a friend who has another friend of ours in Beirut, working there for ADRA, and Steve Colthart, some of you may know him. He was a member of the church I went to before I came here, and his wife Andrada, and he sent this little note. So if you can bear with me, I think it might be of interest to you to hear how our church is going over there, because they're employed over there working for our church. And he sent this note to his mother, Michelle Colthart. I've forgotten she's remarried, what her new name is, unless my wife can help me. But anyway, she's thinking too. Steve heard a low rumble that sounded like thunder. So he went out on the balcony of his unit to investigate. He saw a column of smoke rising from the city. It suddenly exploded and he was nearly knocked off his feet with the blast. Their windows were shattered with glass everywhere. 2 heavy front doors of our union office were blown off their hinges and windows were shattered. Everyone safe, but there is an SDA school in a city closer to the blast and not sure yet of the casualties or damage. So grateful to God that Stephen and Andrada were not right in the Beirut shopping centre when the explosion happened. And then he did a follow-up. He said the 2 SDA schools in Beirut were heavily damaged. The refugee centre lost every window and was extensively damaged. The Arabic church lost every window. Some church members have minor injuries, but we're now hearing stories of friends and family members who have died, being injured, or simply vanished. The first responders, notice this, I hadn't heard this, the first responders to the disaster was a fire truck driven by 4 men. They raced towards the disaster before the second explosion occurred and have disappeared without trace. The disaster and follow-on implications are devastating to a country already struggling with a collapsed economy. So we live in a situation that is a lot better than that. And I meant to mention, in all of my concern about getting here today, when I got on the highway to come here, I had the highway to myself. There was hardly a car going south, and there wasn't one car at the border lined up to get through. So they must have all been having problems getting a permit as well. So to our thoughts for today. When Adam and Eve sinned, they were banished from the Garden of Eden. Angels were put there at the garden to protect the entranceway so that Adam and Eve couldn't get back into the garden to get access to the tree of life. I don't know about you, but when I was a little boy growing up in Sabbath school, and I want to pay tribute to the dedicated Sabbath school teachers that we have in all of our churches. And they told us what the world would be like when Adam and Eve came out of the garden. And I thought about thorns and thistles, and I thought about maybe desert and brown grass and all those sorts of things. But you know, the world at that point in time was nothing like that. It wasn't anywhere near as bad as you might think. Not everything in nature was changed. The trees were massive. They were huge. They were beautifully formed, and their panoply against the sky was absolutely beautiful. Many of the carryovers from the Garden of Eden, the nature was absolutely beautiful. There was green grass with perfectly shaped mountains. Lately, we've been in the lockdown. We go onto YouTube and select, if you've got a good TV and you pull up 4K and look at some of the nature pictures that are available. Absolutely brilliant, but so many of them are rugged mountains. They're and this is the result of the flood. But at this point in time, there were beautifully shaped mountains. There were numerous vines, grape and fruit and trees, all sorts of beautiful fruits that were available. There were beautiful scented flowers that were in abundance. So even though the thorns and thistles were there, here was this new world that Adam and Eve were experiencing. There was gold and silver and precious stones. It was everywhere. There was no need for mining. They didn't need to dig in the ground to find these precious metals. Human beings continued to maintain their original strength. There were even giants, huge men with giant intellects, very clever with their hands. And so with all this wood, and I meant to mention that the trees, the grain of the timber was so hard that it was like rocks. And so with this timber and these stones and the gold and the silver, they built beautiful homes. I'm inclined to think that the homes might have been a lot better than the homes we see in our world today. You don't see any of our homes displaying gold and silver and that on the outside, let alone what it might have looked like on the inside. And these giants and these people who lived in that particular day and age, they built homes and they tried to outdo each other. They wanted to build homes that were better than anyone else's home. And they also built images. And they began to worship these images. And they saw themselves as creators. They were creators even of God. They developed beautiful parklands and gardens with winding paths, and so much so that the magnificent trees created a beautiful rooftop over their existence there. And many of these trees with these winding and these tracks that they made through the woods and the forest, many of those trees were fruit trees and fruit vines. In Psalm 115 and verse 8, it says, speaking of idol worshippers, and those who make and worship them are just as foolish as their idols are. Patriarchs and prophets, it says, it is a law of the human mind that by beholding we become changed. The minds of these people had become wooden, like the images that they worshipped. Things became so bad back in those days that they became daring, and justice was thrown out of the window. Polygamy was practiced very early on, even though it was God's intention that one man, one wife. And it led to men taking women by force, stealing the wives of other men. And these men also loved killing animals, and they became bloodthirsty. And we know, of course, that during this time Methuselah was alive, a man who lived for 969 years. During that period, Methuselah preached his heart out, but he died just the very year that the flood came. And then comes Noah, of course, and when Noah was born, Methuselah was already 369 years of age. And so when Noah is called to preach and to build the ark, he's a middle-aged man. He's now 480 years old, a middle-aged man. He was 600 when the flood came. 600 years of age. Have you ever tried to imagine what it would be like to be that old? What stories you would have to tell, what experiences, if you could remember them, especially if you've got a memory like mine. These men who lived for 900 years and more. And so here we find that after the flood in Genesis 6 and verse 3, it says the average lifespan of a man was 120 years. So things changed dramatically from men living over 900 years, and now suddenly they only live maximum 120 years. Isn't it interesting of late? I don't know whether you've noticed it, if you look in the record, how many of our church members are getting up round the 100 mark and even a little more. And yes, I guess that's probably partly due to technology and healthful living, but I believe God blesses us when we are obedient to him. Methuselah and his sons helped Noah build the ark. But it seems something must have gone wrong, because Methuselah's sons never got a ticket to ride. Only Noah and his family, who were faithful to God. And I don't know about you, but as I tried to imagine this time and this story, Noah would come home from building and working hard on the ark each day, and probably he's pretty harassed because of all the mocking that was going on and the scorn. And I could imagine that Noah's wife kind of suggested, do you think you might be a little bit deluded? Maybe you're on the wrong track. And Noah's sons and their wives, perhaps they joined in and said, hey, Noah, do you really think you've got this straight? Because, wow, you're investing so much of your life in this. Do you really think you need to check and make sure you've got the story straight? I'm not sure what the childbearing age was back in those days. Noah's wife, we don't really know how old she was when she had her first son. But we do know that Noah was 500 years old. And Japheth, of course, was the firstborn. Then came Shem a couple of years later, and Ham. So if I got this correct, so what we see here is God says to Noah, I want you to build an ark. Noah doesn't have any sons. His sons don't come till he's 500 years of age. God tells him when he's 480 to build the ark, and so he starts to work. So does he build it on his own? Or does he hire some other workers to help him? We don't know for sure, but for the first 30 or 40 years, because I imagine that Shem, Ham and Japheth had to grow up a bit before they could be of any real support and help. But Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9 tells us that Noah was a just man, and he was perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. God told Noah, I'm going to destroy the earth for 2 reasons. I want you to remember this, just 2 reasons. The earth was corrupt and it was full of violence. So there's corruption and there's violence. And you notice, you go back a verse to verse 8, it says, but Noah found favour, or some versions say found grace with the Lord. Now, God told Noah how to build the ark. There's 2 that I know of, 2 arks in the world that are built to the exact size prescribed by the Bible. One is in Kentucky, in Tennessee. The other is in Hong Kong. So you want to get some idea if you're ever allowed to travel again overseas. Make sure if you go to Hong Kong, you go and see the ark that is there. The outside dimensions are exactly as the Bible specified. Same with the ark that's over there in Kentucky. So what do we know about the ark? The ark was to be waterproofed. So it had to have tar on the outside. So that model or that replica you just saw didn't have tar on the outside. So they haven't copied it exactly. But the ark had to be waterproof both inside and out with tar. It was to be 137 metres long, or between 450 and 500 feet. It was to be 23 metres or 75 feet wide, 14 metres or 45 feet high, with a 0.5 metre, 18-inch gap around the top of the ark to let in light to all the animals and to let in fresh air, because I imagine the air got a bit stale at times. And there were 3 decks, of course. Now, I don't know this, but I imagine that there were 4 bedrooms. You know, the Bible does tell us that when Noah was told to build the ark, it had to have a lot of rooms. And I assume, of course, there were rooms for the animals. If you ever go to Pennsylvania, there's a Christian group there that reenacts a lot of the Bible stories. We went to see the one on Noah's Ark on one occasion, and we're sitting in the audience, seats 2,000 people, and they pull back the curtains and we're surrounded, going up 3 stories with little cubicles and animals in every cubicle. And I don't know whether that was how the ark looked inside. We don't really know, but at least they were told to build rooms. I imagine they needed a bathroom. They probably needed a kitchen. I imagine they had a family room somewhere where they could worship. There were to be storerooms for food for the humans and the animals. They must have had to have a water tank, both to get water to wash in, to drink. They needed those necessities, and they must have had some kind of toilet system. I couldn't find anywhere, as I studied on this topic, that boat had a rudder. No steering mechanism, no big wheel that Noah could turn. Well, there was really nowhere to see anyway, or what was there to look at, except that maybe he might have needed to direct the ark into the waves so that it didn't sway too much. But I understand that it was God who was driving that boat. The timber that was used to build the ark was made of cypress or gopher wood, which was so hard it would never deteriorate over the 120 years it took to build the ark. I don't know how they managed to cut the timber up, because I don't believe they had power tools, but they must have had some kind of mechanism that they had developed that they could cut the timber with. And crowds of people came to watch. Something like nothing else on earth was happening. Noah, Methuselah, and their sons are working on this massive project. And they took opportunity while they were there, as the crowds gathered round to watch, to preach and to tell them what was going to take place. And there were some, as they listened to Methuselah and Noah preach from the ark, and they responded and they gave their hearts to God. But time went on and on and on, and they saw no rain come, no flood, no nothing. And they stepped away from their faith. And it says in Patriarchs and Prophets, here we go, for none are so reckless and go to such lengths in sin as do those who have once had light, but have resisted the convicting Spirit of God. They even told themselves that they would not obey the law of God because God would never destroy sinners. Noah was a fanatic, and the crowd shouted at him, why would God, who made all of this, why would he get rid of it? All this beautiful land that we have and all the wonderful things, the gold, the silver, why would God want to get rid of all of that? They said, we've never seen the rivers overflow their boundaries. I believe very firmly that if the people had repented, that God would not have destroyed the earth with a flood. In fact, I have it on very good authority. He would not have done it. Remember Nineveh? Remember Nineveh? The people repented. And I wonder how Noah would have responded in such a situation. Would he have been like Jonah? What would he have done with the ark, even if it was even half built? What would God have done with the ark? We don't know. But despite the criticism and the mockery that he endured, Noah kept his faith firm. Finally, he makes his last appeal to the people. Probation is closing. Noah had finished the ark. There's still a crowd standing around mocking him, and all of a sudden there's total silence. The mocking stops. Everyone looks up, and there is a rushing mighty wind coming towards the ark. And they look up, and it's thousands of birds flying towards the ark. Animals of all descriptions are coming out of the forest, and they're walking towards the ark. And it says again in Patriarchs and Prophets, animals obeyed the command of God while men were disobedient. And the angels lined the animals up 2 by 2 and walked them to the plank of the ark. You know, I don't know about you, but you can watch magic happen on TV, and I'm sure you've seen people do magic and you can't explain how they do things. But as these people that were standing around mocking, they saw all these birds and all these animals walking up into the ark, they just thought it was a big circus event. It was magic. Noah's pulled a trick on us. They did not believe that this was the power of God at work. I don't know about you, I've tried to imagine, as I read some of the Bible stories, what it would have been like to be there. And I imagine finally Noah and his 3 sons and his wife and their wives, they finally begin to walk up the plank into the ark. And I can imagine them turning around, looking over their shoulder, wondering what the crowd were going to do now. Are they going to rush us and try and get on board as well, having seen this miraculous event that's just taken place? But it's all over for the crowd, not only for those who were standing around watching, but for all of those who had been there before and listened to Noah and Methuselah preach. So Noah's inside with his family. They're now inside the ark. The animals are all in there. Suddenly there's a flash of light, brighter than any lightning anyone had ever seen or ever might see in the future. There's now a bright light hovering over the doorway into the ark. And angels take that massive door, and it must have been huge because it had to allow these great animals to come in through there 2 by 2. A door that was so heavy that no man could actually manage, and the angels take that door and slowly close it. So we're told that Noah was shut in, but the rejectors of God's mercy were shut out. So God shut the door, and only He could open it. And there's a similar day coming for our world, and it's not very far away. So Noah and his family go into lockdown for 7 days. They're there, sitting in the ark. I imagine it was pretty dark and dingy because I don't know whether they're on the top floor or the middle floor or the bottom floor, but the only light coming in is from an 18-inch gap around the top. And they're sitting there for 7 days and nothing's happening. Nothing. And they could hear the crowd outside, and they're getting louder and louder and getting more and more violent, and they're starting to get worried that they might actually be able to break in. The cruise of a lifetime. Ruby Princess had nothing on this. There's no virus on board either. And I don't think that Noah, when he went on to the ark with all his family, had any idea that he was going to be there for 10.5 months. Noah and his family really started to worry for their own lives. But day 8 came and their faith was rewarded. They suddenly heard large raindrops coming down from the sky, something that no one had ever seen before in their lives. I don't think Noah had any idea what was going to happen or how it was going to happen. Massive gushes of water came up out of the ground, throwing rocks hundreds of meters into the air. And as they came back down, they buried themselves in the earth. Those gushes of water started to fill the earth. You know, I was watching TV the other day, and they were doing a feature on Ayers Rock. I couldn't believe my ears when I heard the ranger telling the people, he said, you know what? He said, this rock here, it's almost like it was a rock that was taken way up in the air, and when it came down, more than 2/3 of that rock is buried under the ground. It's almost like it went up and it came down. And he said, you know what? There was a sea of water that covered this whole area, and it wasn't until the sea receded millions of years ago that now we see Ayers Rock. Well, the sky grew darker and darker. The beautiful homes and parks and idols and altars, they were thrown in all directions. All the animals went wild with fear. You know, I found this statement from patriarchs and prophets fascinating. It says, Satan himself, who was compelled to remain in the midst of the warring elements, feared for his own existence. Satan was right there in the middle of all this destruction and mayhem. And he told those who would listen to him at this point, I'm not sure how many people would be ready to listen when everything's going into a huge, massive explosion like it happened in Beirut. But anyone that would listen, he told them that God was unjust, he was cruel. Some of the people even now tried to smash their way into the ark. But it was built so strong they had no hope. Some were even able and successful. I don't know how they did this, but they were able to hang on until the ark actually began to float on the water. And it wasn't until they were knocked off as the ark hit rocks and trees and they were thrown back into the water. It wasn't a picnic for those inside the ark either. As the ark jostled and bumped and moved around, the animals began to bellow inside the ark and they began to make loud noises. Eventually the ark rose above all of that. I'm not sure how I would have travelled on that occasion without a few seasick pills, but it was a pretty rough ride as the boat trembled and shook as Noah and his family sat wondering what was going to happen. You know, I don't know how some of these things happened, but I believe it did. But some people, realising what was about to take place, tied their children to wild animals, knowing that the wild animals would race to the highest level to save themselves. They tied their children to these wild animals. Some even tied themselves to the top of trees on the top of mountains. Some even fought animals for the last little space on the top of the mountain that they might be saved. But we're told that everyone perished. And another storm is coming. The next storm will be a storm of fire. Matthew 24, we know it well, but I'm reading it from a modern translation. It says, "The world will be at ease, banquets and parties and weddings, just as it was in Noah's time before the sudden coming of the flood. People wouldn't believe what was going to happen until the flood actually arrived and took them all away. So shall my coming be." We live today in a copy of antediluvian times. Crime, murder, extravagance, fraud, bribery, injustice, atrocities, intemperance, lust, and pleasure seeking. All summed up in the two words that God described: there was corruption and violence. Look at what's going on in the US at the moment, the violence there. So the water kept rising. It rose until it was 25 feet or 8 meters above the highest mountain. And during the 10.5 months that Noah and his family were on the ark, there were many occasions when they thought they were going to die. I bet you if they had Wi-Fi on the ark, Noah and his family would have been checking the news every day, checking the news to see what was happening. But it was just bad news, bad news, bad news. But I want to come to the actual story in Genesis 8. If you want to open your Bibles with me, Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1. And I love this verse because in the middle of this terrible situation, it says, "But God," verse 1, chapter 8, "but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded." Wow, I love that. God remembered Noah. Just when you're convinced in your life that God has forgotten you, when things around you are not going so well, we need to remember that God remembered Noah. In fact, if you go on to the next book of the Bible, to the book of Exodus, the same word for remember is used again in chapter 2 and verse 22. And speaking of the children of Israel, it says, "And God heard their groanings, and he remembered them." So God remembered Noah, God remembered the children of Israel, and God remembers you and he remembers me. Did you ever think he was going to forget us? Never. You know, this pandemic that has hit us here in Australia, but all over the world, couldn't have come at a worse time for us here. I heard someone earlier in the program talking about the drought and the floods and the bushfires that we've all experienced, but we thought everything was going to be fine, and all of a sudden now we're dealing with this situation. There is truth in the matter that some of you are fighting your own battles aside from all of this. You are warring against the enemy. But let's talk about COVID-19 for a moment. Don't want you to misunderstand me, but I kind of feel in this community, in this area, we've dodged the COVID-19 bullet. Doesn't mean to say your lives haven't been touched or impacted by it. Even our own Pastor Quinton, his mum and dad got the virus. But we understand now they're doing really well. And so we can be thankful to God that perhaps here we're doing okay. But we tend to forget that COVID-19 is not the only killer disease that we're facing. Only the last few weeks I've learnt that two of my close friends are both battling melanoma cancer right throughout their bodies. But for some of you, I suppose you could be excused if you were to cry out to God and say, God, where are you? Have you forgotten me? Look at what's going on in my life. Look at what's happening to me. I want to come back to Genesis 8 because I love this verse, as I said before, and I want to read it again. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth and the waters receded. You might begin to think that it's all over now for Noah, but it isn't. He's only halfway through. He's still got 150 days to go, plus another 40 and another 7 and another 7. And God's not ready to open the door to let Noah out yet. So how many days has it been for us? We go back to March 13, we didn't have a church service here. And it's been 147 days and nights since that first Sabbath that we were unable to meet together. But it looks like Noah has got us beaten. He knows something about being locked down. Can you imagine really not being able to... Yeah, they had one window which he opened, and I'm kind of guessing that the window was a wooden window. You couldn't see through it, no glass. And so they can't even see where they're going, and he opens that window to let the birds out to see if there's any land. So here they are locked inside these walls. My daughter and her family are hopefully arriving in a couple of weeks' time from Hong Kong to live here. And they've got 3 little girls under 10 years of age who now got to be locked up in a hotel room for 2 weeks. And we shudder at the thought of how that's going to work out. But, you know, the thought is that we're going to emerge. We're going to come out of this. There's going to be a new world, but what's it going to look like? It's going to be very different to what we've been used to. So what comes next? We become fixated on washing our hands and sneezing into our elbow and hand scrubbing and mask wearing and hyper-attention at cleaning every little surface that we come in contact with. I heard about a little cartoon the other day. This mother was just prepared dinner and she had the family all sitting around the table, and she said, all right, boys and girls, have you washed your elbows yet? So hygiene is what we're living with. Shopping centres, going out for dinner, newspapers, they're all on the endangered list. Businesses are going broke. Government's handing out money, and how long can that go on? It won't be the same again. So what's the point here? Noah and his family, and we too, we're going to emerge out of this situation, but what's it going to be like? So it was for Noah and his family of 7 as they emerged into the bright sunlight of a broken and devastated horizon. I've tried to imagine what was on their faces. What did they see? How bad did it affect them? But let's notice what it says in verse 15 of chapter 8. Now God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number upon it." You know, it dawns upon Noah that these animals are huge and wild. By the way, that's a picture taken of the Hong Kong Noah's Ark, and that's what you see when you go there. So God assures Noah that he's going to be in charge of all the animals. Doesn't mean to say that, if he's caught lurking around a bush, a lion might get him. But overall, mankind would be in charge of the animal kingdom. So Noah comes out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. And it's impossible for you and me to really comprehend the shock that he must have seen. Just remember, when he got on the ark, he was used to seeing beautiful homes, lovely trees, perfectly shaped mountains. And now all he sees is absolute devastation. Have you ever seen a bombed out landscape? Well, we saw pictures during the week of Beirut. I don't know whether many of you remember seeing the black and white photos of Hiroshima. Did you realise that on last Thursday, the 6th, was the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima? It was another significant day then. It was Lyndon's birthday on the 6th. He's not 75 yet, that I know of. But here they come out of the ark and they see this terrible scene. So the earth again is cursed by God. Cursed when Adam and Eve came out of the garden, and it's cursed again when the flood comes and destroys everything. So we don't need to make this stuff up. Patriarchs and Prophets says, the earth presented an appearance of confusion and desolation impossible to describe. Impossible to describe. And this moved me when I read this, that a wind came and moved all the dead bodies, that's of animals and human beings, and moved them to a special place on this earth and covered them with the tops of mountains, the broken trees, and all the rubble was sent to one place to bury all these bodies. The forests that were destroyed were all buried, and they have become our source of coal and oil and the precursor of volcanoes. So what does Noah do? He's on his face. He's not weeping. He's worshipping his Creator. And I believe that if he'd known the words of Job, who came later, he would have said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked I shall return. The Lord gives, the Lord takes. Blessed be the name of the Lord." So here we have the family of 8. They're down on the ground and they're worshipping. I mean, what else can you do when you walk out of an ark and you've got nothing to see virtually except destruction, and you're alive, and you've still got the ark, I guess, to go back in and live in if you had to, because there's nowhere else. And he gets down on his knees and he starts to pray to God. Let's read it in verse 20. Then Noah built an ark to the Lord, and taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings. The Lord smelled a pleasing aroma. The aroma, I believe, that God smelled was the smell he got of Calvary, the day when Jesus himself would be the sacrifice for all of us. And he said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, or even every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood." Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. And as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. A new world, a new world. So before Noah builds a house, he builds an altar. And isn't that how life should be for all of us? The first thing in our lives, the first priority that we should ever consider is God first. Uncertainty. You know, I think about Paul. Paul was condemned to death in Jerusalem. If ever there was a man who was uncertain, it was him. On the one hand, if he falls into the hands of the Jews, he's going to be killed. If he falls into the hands of the Roman Emperor Nero, he's going to be killed probably. It was that way for Paul. It was that way for Jesus. It was that way for Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'm talking about a new normal, a new experience that Jesus is now facing. Does it go this way or does it go that way? As Jesus begins to consider this, the anguish of his brain. On the one hand, Jesus knows, of course, that his mission is to come here and to die and to save us from our sins. But on the other hand, there is the realization, and his being must resist the thought that salvation might come at the price of annihilation of himself forever and ever. New world of uncertainty. I don't know whether you've ever read the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you haven't, you ought to. There's several biographies been written about this man. Here was a man who had to decide between his own nation plunging into despotism with Hitler killing all the Jews, and on the other hand, standing back and doing nothing as the Jews are slaughtered in racial hatred. What about Australia right now? How is a godly Australian supposed to live in this situation? What do we do about all this racial fracturing that's taking place in our world? Does it become a pandemic on our collective souls that we should proactively seek to eradicate? Will we work as hard as we can to get rid of racism as we do to get rid of COVID-19? No one is exempt. We all face choices. But be warned if you are a follower of Jesus. John Howard Yoder says, if you are a follower of Jesus, you need to know where his social ethic ends. It ends on a cross. We need to weigh that decision very carefully. If we follow Jesus, we need to know where his social ethic ends. And if you follow Jesus, you need to talk about the cross of Jesus. Jesus embraced social non-conformity and non-violence. It's absolutely clear. It took him to the cross. He had moral courage, and it's the only way it's going to be in the world if we want to get through. Ethical bravery. But there is hope. The hope that God gave to Noah and what he gave to us. Just a few more verses. Genesis 9 and verse 12 says, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. That's you and me. A covenant for all generations to come. And then he goes on and says, I've set my rainbow in the clouds, and it'll be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. You know, some of the most beautiful scenes you can see in nature are when God puts the rainbow in the clouds. And I can imagine as Noah listens to God speaking to him and making this promise to him, that I will set my bow in the clouds, and it is a promise, a covenant I'm making with you, that I'm not going to destroy the earth by water and by flood ever again. Maybe God has put a bow in your cloud. And you say, what do you mean? Maybe your life is covered by a cloud right now. And you don't know why, and you can't understand why God has allowed this to happen to you. But if you look closely enough at the cloud, you'll see the rainbow. You'll see the rainbow. The final verse I want to share with you today is Isaiah 54 and verse 9. God is speaking and he says, "To me this is like the days of Noah, when I swore that the waters of Noah would never again cover the earth. Though the mountains be shaken and the hills be removed." Wow. You didn't have to tell Noah too much about that experience. So Noah has seen the mountains move and the hills and everything shaken, and the floodwaters have covered the earth. And he says, "Yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken." Wow. Isn't that beautiful? Though your earth is shaken, though you live under a cloud, whatever it is you're facing in your life, though the earth be moved, my love for you will not be shaken. Let's bow our heads. Loving Father, we thank you so much that you made us this promise. Lord, you've allowed us to go through some difficult situations sometimes, and we don't know why. But we know, Lord, that if we stay true and firm to you, we'll be able to see the rainbow. We'll be able to see what it is that you're trying to teach us, what we need to learn. Lord, even though the mountains are shaken and moved, your love for us is not shaken. We claim that love today in Jesus' name. Amen. Happy Sabbath, everyone. Hope you enjoy the week to come.